J. Warner Wallace is a cold case homicide detective who's been investigating cold case murders in Los Angeles County for over a decade. His work has been featured on Fox News, Dateline, and Court TV. Now, we join him as he applies his investigative skills to making a case for Christianity.
Thanks for joining us at Cold Case Christianity. I am J. Warner Wallace. Today we're going to talk about death. It sounds like a morbid topic, but a lot of us would say that we are genuinely afraid to die. Well, in this video, I'm going to show you in just a few minutes what one worldview you could hold that'll help you not fear death. Maybe you think you see this coming, but I think you'll find it fascinating because it's not just my opinion. It's not just a matter of my personal preferences that I would say that Christianity has a unique role to play in this. But it turns out clinical research demonstrates this, and not just any kind of Christian belief will do. So today we're going to talk about, are you afraid to die? Well, you're probably not a Christian. Now, that's a bold statement, and I suspect that many of the viewers that visit us on YouTube or at NRBtv, especially if you're not a Christian, you might argue against this, right? Or you might wonder, well, yeah, maybe this false belief of Christianity has some therapeutic value. But I want to tell you that there's actually good reason to believe that's not the case, that there's something else that is at stake here, something else about the way we think. Now, I've written about this online, so you can go to our website at coldcasechristianity.com, and you'll find our website has the article exactly as I posted it here as a video. And of course, sometimes these get picked up and they get put other places around the internet, on Town Hall. Even some of these ended up at Fox News, but this particular article also appears at the Christian Post. So you've got a couple places where you can find this article. Just look for the same name that you have here. And what's great about that is it includes links. The links are in our article. The article is posted under this video if you're on YouTube, and you'll be able to see, we can be able to kind of chase those links down and see what we're talking about in terms of studies. Now, as I thought about, like, why would people fear death? And I've talked about this publicly, and I get a couple different reactions. Where people will say, well, it's not so much that I fear death as a conceptually or in the larger sense of what death is. It's that I fear the point of passage, right, between life and death, if it's painful. So sometimes when people say they fear death, some would say, well, yeah, it's not that I fear the idea of death as much as I fear what I think is going to be the physical pain of moving from this life to another. Okay. Does Christianity have any way of helping you deal with pain or suffering? Yeah, I think it does. I think that people, if you've known sincere, devout Christians, you've known that they've handled suffering in a way that is remarkably different than the way that the rest of us do, right? And I have been part of the rest of us. Look, even though I believe Christianity is true, I have known dear brothers and sisters who do a better job of embracing the truth claims, of actually the promises of God, of trusting God through difficulty. I spent so many years as an atheist, 35 years, that I still have a hard time trusting God for certain things, or being patient through suffering, patience through some small inconvenience, right? So if you're like that, if you're like me, you may find yourself struggling with issues related to suffering. But Christianity does, you see this all the time, that God is not going to necessarily take away the suffering. He's going to be with you through the suffering. And for a lot of people who understand that, their suffering is different, and it looks different, and they experience it in a different way. Now, in order to talk about this episode today, I'm not going to refer to the promises that you find in Scripture, or this is why Christians think that we can suffer better, or we fear death less, blah, 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 blah. I'm not going to base it on biblical teaching, although, of course, you can find justification for this in the Scriptures. Instead, what I want to do is refer to a study that came out in the last couple of years, which I found to be fascinating. This study was called, it's in the Journal of Cognitive Science, and it's entitled Death and the Self. And this study reveals a direct link between our sense of self and our fear of death. Our sense of self and our fear of death. And as a matter of fact, this study, which is not done by, it's not a Christian study on a Christian website, but it found that of all the groups who believe in particular worldviews, Christians have a better notion or a stronger belief in what they term in this study as the persisting self, quote unquote, the persisting self. And it's that notion of who you are and this notion of the persisting self that shapes the way you view, the way you anticipate, and the way you deal with death. This idea that that's a pretty interesting idea, right? This notion that your fear of death is not aligned necessarily with your bravery, your courage, your sense of trusting, stamina, kind of like, just a stiff upper lipper. It's like a stiff upper lip. I can kind of muscle through any kind of... No, and it turns out that your fear of death is proportional to your sense of self, especially your sense of what the true self is. I am J. Warner Wallace. What does that mean? What is the self? How do I see myself? And this idea that do I persist beyond the grave? Or is there a persisting self that isn't tied to my worldly, material, physical experience here on earth? That ends up being huge in terms of when it's measured and when it's polled and when people are surveyed. In this study, again, it is this study called Death and Self by the Journal of Cognitive Science. I've given you a link in the article on our website. Here's the argument. This idea of continuity of self or persisting self, the notion of who and what we are, ourselves, is, quote, something that persists from childhood through old age. You exist to the extent that your self exists. And if you hold a worldview that can reasonably demonstrate that your persisting self transcends your mortal physical experience, you are far more likely to fear death. Doesn't that make sense? Because, if it's just a matter of fearing the pain of death, or maybe of fearing the sadness of departing from our friends, you could see now that a Christian worldview has something to say about both of those things. And so this is why people who hold a notion of persisting self, or a continuity of self, as they describe, quote unquote, actually fear death at a much lower rate and in a much different way. So what I want to do is take a quick break. I'm going to come back and I'm going to show you, compare 4 worldviews, 3 that are theistic and more or less, and 1 that is not, and kind of explain why Christianity is uniquely capable of providing you with this notion of continuity of self, persistent or persisting self. We'll do that right after the break.
All right, last one, and I'd appreciate if you stayed in your seat this
Okay.
time. Oh my God. I've got witnesses. Several people wrote in, I think they're leading questions, but they're like, so what?
Yeah.
Sort of like you asked him, so what? You wrote this book about this. So what if God's the answer to this?
So that's the question. So yeah.
So what?
Got it. Well, okay. Let me ask you a question. Do you think it matters? Do you think we would behave differently if none of us believed there was any purpose to life? Do you think we behave differently? I think you would. Now, why do we think there's a purpose to life? You can say, well, I create my own purpose to life. Really? Okay, so if I find something up here, see how he set me up? So if I was to find out something, let's say I was to come alongside this, and I've discovered this thing sitting on the counter, okay? And here it is. It's this little widget. So here's a little widget here, it's sitting here, and I'm finding out on the camera, I'm like, dang, what is that for? What is the purpose of this widget? If you didn't know the purpose of this widget, honestly you didn't know, but you wanted to find out tonight what the purpose of the widget is, what would you do? What would you?
You'd Google it. No, listen. Okay, but you could do that. Look, I could say, well, look, it could be a number of things. I could use it to hold open a door. It's a door, it's got an angle. I could put it in doorstop. I could find other uses for this. I could. I could use it to prop up my keyboard. I could find other uses, but I really want to know what was it designed for, because it seems to me I'll get the most out of it if I know what its intended purpose was. Well, how do I find that? You're going to Google it. Okay, fine. So how are you going to Google it? What are you going to look for? What if I told you that there was a manufacturer on the side? You type this in, right? Okay, fine. So now it turns out what you're thinking is that the best way to discover the purpose of this widget is to ask the manufacturer. Okay. So now you know why it matters.
Okay, so let's talk about 4 worldviews and how they understand and define our existence, our sense of self. And you'll see why of all of these, remember, those worldviews that describe you as a being that persists beyond the grave, beyond our material existence, this idea of continuity of self. We fear death less. Well, it makes sense, right? Because we're not what is dying? Are we dying? Is our notion of self ending? Or does it continue beyond death? That would give you a different perspective on that portal that we call death. So let's take a look at 4 worldviews and see how their notion of self either assists us or works against us in our perception and increases our fear or decreases our fear of death. The first one I want to show you here is Buddhism. So Buddhism argues against the existence of self altogether. Here's what I mean. According to Buddhism, your sense of self is really just illusory. It's an illusion altogether. And so if you think about that for a minute, if your sense of self is an illusion, then there is no self beyond the grave, because your entire notion of self has been an illusion to begin with. So you have no sense, even if you're from a Buddhistic perspective, you don't have confidence, or you don't have what we call this continuity of self, because there is no self to continue. The entire thing was an illusion to begin with. So you can see why under Buddhism you may not have the confidence, or you might fear, or you might be apathetic. You certainly have no hope of a continuity of self, because there is no worldview structure for self to begin with, anything other than an illusion. So that's why Buddhism, and when Buddhists are surveyed on this issue, they actually fear death at a higher rate than do Christians. Let's take another look at another worldview. Let's take a look at Hinduism. Now, Hinduism actually, as you probably know if you're familiar with it, it really has this notion of reincarnation, the reincarnation of self. So yes, it's true. You may continue. The self that we think of may continue into the next life. Got that. But all of your characteristics of the reincarnated version of you, your attributes, your traits, even your memories, will all be very different than the self that you think of today. So if by self you mean the entire collection of my experiences, memories, innate nature, all of these things, your characteristics, all of these are what go into defining yourself, well, then you'd have to at least admit that at the end of this life, that's all going to be erased and reproduced in some other form. So this self that you know today, that you define this way today, will not continue into the next life, even if you believe in reincarnation. So even under Hinduism, there is this notion that you will be losing your self will not continue, and its continuity of self, as they describe it. The more you believe in the continuity of self, the less you fear death. But under Hinduism and under Buddhism, there is no real continuity of self. Let's take a look at another worldview. Of course, atheism. Now, atheism argues for an entirely physical version, a materialistic version of self. You're just a material being. That's all you are, a physical being. You're nothing more, basically, than your body. In other words, self and body are synonymous. So if once your body ceases to exist, your self ceases to exist. So, this is like I always believed for 35 years. You come out of the dirt, evolved creatures, and eventually we end up back in the dirt contributing to the ecosystem that it contributes to other creatures. Your self ends. And I would have said I have no problem with that. But when polled, people who believe that the self ends at the end of this life, they fear the end of self, because it's all you get then. Like I always say, under atheism, all you have is the line segment known as 90 years, right? Dot to dot. Just that your birth, line segment to death, and that's it. And so as I'm now going to be entering, I'm at the end of my 50s. So as I enter into each decade, basically in that line segment, I'm running out of line segment. So you can see why the only experiences I can look forward to are the few that I have left. You see how that kind of thinking can contribute to a fear of running out of experiences, running out of life, even the quality of life. Because let's face it, the quality of life from, say, 15 to 70 is pretty decent compared to 70 to 90. So I think in the end, I could see why you would fear death, given that under atheism, the only life you could ever live, there is no continuity of self, no persisting self beyond the 90 years. Now let's go to the last one, of course, which is Christianity. Christianity offers a different view. It argues for a dualistic sense of self. Look, according to our Christian worldview, you're more than just a physical being. You're more than just a material being. You are a soulish creature. Who you really are is not the shell. The egg that you talk about, if you're holding an egg, this is an egg. Do you mean the shell of the egg, or do you mean what's inside the shell? There's a sense in which our bodies are mere shells, and our true self is the soulish nature of who we are. And the soul transcends your experiences. It transcends it carries all the stuff that you typically think of as self, right? Your characteristics, your attributes, your traits, even your memories. Your experiences are part of that soulish collection of attributes that then transcends physical death. There's no reason to believe that your physical death of the shell means the death of the soul, the death of the soulish creature you are. Under this view, you have a persisting self, because your self is soulish. You're a soulish creature. So with a persisting self like this, you can anticipate something beyond the grave. And that's why, unsurprisingly, Christians fear death less than others, because we have a robust view of ourselves extending beyond the grave, and this idea of the continuity of self is the key to not fearing death. All right, take a break. When we come back, I want to show you that this is not just there's a certain kind of belief or a certain kind of faith in Christianity that actually produces this fear of, this lack of fear of death, or this decreased fear of death. Not just any view that you might hold as a Christian will get this done. And we'll talk about that right after the break.
What's your name?
Brian.
Brian, good to meet you.
You as well. Thanks for coming to Columbus. You were great at XSI as well.
Oh, thanks.
Yes. So are you familiar with the Euthyphro dilemma?
Yes.
Okay.
So for those who may not and everyone I talk to about this has a different way of parsing it out. So sure. Parse it out for everyone, and then we'll try to respond to it.
Sure. The way I've learned about it is that if God is the moral, how do I say it? I'm going to butcher this. If God is the moral source for our morals, does he have a reason, yes or no? If the answer is no, then he's illogical and therefore he's not perfect. If the answer is yes, then his reasoning is the higher standard for morality. If that, would you say I hit that on the head?
Yeah, so here's how I typically would struggle with it before. Okay, so look, if all moral truths are simply proclamations of God, then God could easily change his mind on certain things and they would no longer be morally virtuous or morally vile. In other words, if rape is only wrong because God said it is so, well then God could change his mind, right? And it could be okay. Doesn't seem right, right? Or maybe what it is that no, rape is wrong and God understands, recognizes this principle and simply transmits it to us. Well, if that's the case, we can take God out of the process. If rape is wrong, transcendently, we don't need God to tell us. We can find it some other way.
Yeah.
So you have two choices. Either he's the source of moral truth, in which case it seems kind of like willy-nilly, he could change his mind, or he's simply the transmitter of moral truth, in which case he could step out of the way and we could still know moral truth. Well, that's the two dilemmas, right, this problem. But that's not what Christians believe anyway. I mean, our view is that he's not the source. He's not creating moral law. He's not sitting down one night and going, okay, I got to do 10 commandments by tomorrow. Okay, let's think, first commandment. And he writes it down. And he's not also saying, I know that there are these 10 commandments, I just need to make sure I articulate them well to my people. He's not doing that either. What we would say is that no, his nature, he is by his very nature the source of moral truth. It's just an expression of his nature. He doesn't create this. It's just a reflection of his moral nature. If you put salt in water, you get salty water. Take the salt out, you have no salty water. Because we're in a universe governed by God, we have moral obligations. We sense the universe is salty. Take out the God, take out the salt, it's no longer salty. So we would say that moral truths are simply a reflection of his nature. They're simply what happens when God is in a universe. It becomes filled with his nature, and then we sense these obligations. It also becomes filled with his logical nature, and we also have those same logical constructs because that salt is also in the water.
Yes.
So that's how I would answer that.
Perfect.
Makes
Thanks.
sense? Okay, sure.
Okay, so let's go back to the definition, how we talked about the non-physical nature of self that's described in Christianity. Take a look again. Again, what we're saying here is that we hold a dualistic view. And we see this in Scripture all the time, right? We're told, Jesus says that whoever believes in me, though he die, he shall live. John 11. We know that our persisting self will actually extend in. Read Luke chapter 16 verses 19 to 31 and tell me that there isn't a persisting self. So Christianity teaches this, but not everyone who would call themselves a Christian experiences reduced fear about death. Why would that be the case? Well, it turns out they've done some work on this to see why that is the case. Like, who amongst Christians, if Christians are the group that fears death the least, and there's a variation between Christians, people who identify as Christians, as to the level to which they fear death. Well, what's caused that? Why is there a difference between some Christians and not others? Well, there's been some work done, study done on this, and I've posted it as one of the links in the article on our website, so you can kind of see the article has links to all these. Read it. This is an article that is not, again, on a Christian website. I'm posting you a link to the article on phys.org. It's a study into who is least afraid of death. Okay, so this is kind of describing the study and looking at it from the University of Oxford, and take a look and see what it says. Here's what it says. It basically says that people whose, quote, religious behavior is motivated by pragmatic considerations, such as the social or emotional benefits of following a religion, they are far more likely to fear death than those who, quote, religious behavior is driven by, quote unquote, true belief. That's interesting. In other words, if you're just somebody who has a cultural view, you just embrace Christianity because, let's say, your parents were Christians, and so you've been going to church your whole life, but you never really give it much thought, and you don't really act as though it's true, and it's not as though it has any transformational power in your life. You are just kind of a cultural Christian by name only, basically. I would identify this way, but I don't really even read the Scripture to know why, what it says about this. But I do, I try to follow. I'm a good person. I try to be a good person. I try to represent Jesus in a way, but you're not actually competent to describe back, like, why do we believe there's a soul? You realize there's good biblical reason and good philosophical reason to believe we are soulish creatures. And the Bible has a lot to say about where your soul would go once your body dies. As a matter of fact, I've written about this at Cold-Case Christianity. You can find that article as well, just in an effort to say, okay, look, there's good. And if you're a Christian, you ought to know where it is in Scripture you can go to learn more about your life after your mortal body dies. But a lot of us, let's face it, we don't. We don't know because for the most part, we are Christian in name only. So it turns out that the study I showed you, the study on who is least afraid of death, demonstrates that those folks who are just kind of like culturally in and they think it has some benefit. I bring my kids to church, teach them good values, give me a routine, it makes my marriage better. Those folks fear death at the same rate as non-Christians, dang near. It turns out that true believers, according to this study, fear death less. Now, why would that be the case? Well, it turns out that we are actually able, by holding true, justified, warranted belief, it means that we hold a forensic faith. In other words, it's not held blindly, so that the first time we encounter difficulty, even the threat of death, we stumble over it because we never examined. Why should I trust what Scripture? Have I been believing what Scripture says about death anyway, blindly, without actually examining it evidentially? Like I always say, once you've seen your ballistic vest stop bullets in the range, you've seen it, you've tested it, you have good evidence that it will stop bullets, you are far more likely to trust your vest in the field. And I've illustrated this perfectly in a book called Cold-Case Christianity. I have worked officer-involved shootings in which officers decided to trust their vest. And I'll tell you, you only get there with that level of trust if you got through the lens of having watched the vest stop bullets in the range. In other words, if you will examine the evidence for your beliefs, you are far more likely to act on those beliefs. And that's why true believers who hold a forensic faith do a lot better in terms of fear when it comes to death. Why? Because for the most part, they're able to kind of work through evidentially all those issues. They get it. I've got good reason to believe this is true. I can ground that reason in clear thinking from Scripture evidentially. Therefore, when times get tough, I will stand calmly in my vest without fear. That's the kind of forensic faith that changes the way you see life, and it changes the way you fear death. So I hope this has been helpful. It turns out, if you fear death, there's a good chance you're not a true believer who has a forensic faith as a Christian. Because it turns out all the studies show that those kinds of folks fear death less. Hope this has been helpful. See you back here next week at Cold Case Christianity.
To hear more from J. Warner Wallace, please visit coldcasechristianity.com. For more information on this week's topic, visit youtube.com/coldcasechristianity with J. Warner Wallace. Thank you for joining us on this Cold Case Christianity broadcast.